Preface. This novella takes place right after the events of the first novel, When They Whisper. They flesh out an important area of the universe. If you want to experience the storyline without spoilers, I highly recommend you read that first. Thanks for supporting my creative endeavors and welcome. Chapter 1. Dots and Crosses. Hurtin meticulously folded the crumpled note her brother had sent her. So, this is it, huh? The pit. She looked out from her balcony. Caldine was an arid primary planet in Sector 2, with a few key cities spread out across its otherwise barren surface. The planet was the largest producer of energy crystals across the galaxy. Even from this far into the city, she could discern the monstrous mine known as the Pit in the distance. The gaping hole stretched a few kilometers wide. It had been said that its depths reached further down than towers were tall. The gentle morning breeze tugged at the sheer curtains that adorned all the windows of the penthouse suite they found themselves in. She tightened her satin gown around her waist, the smooth marble cold underfoot. Turning around, she smiled at a scarred umber back and naked buttocks. He looked so peaceful. The sheets were strewn all over the large bed. "It's time to get to work, my love," Hurtin said, maneuvering herself over to the muscular back, gently running her finger down a particularly protruded scar. The man did not move. She slapped his exposed rump. This time his head turned slowly. The faintest smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. She gently rubbed her thumb over a scar in the form of a struck-through H on his cheek. "Always remember, my fuerte, you belong to me." She smiled. Her dark curls fell rebelliously over her face. She blew a few upward as she kissed the man's forehead. "Always by my side, always loyal." She stared into his eyes. His deep brown eyes stared back at her, not saying a word. "Come on, then. We have a lot to do." She hopped up and let her smooth satin gown fall to the floor. She started rummaging through a dresser on the opposite end of the room. Her olive skin and thick curls made her feel at home in Sector 2. She was born on a fringe planet not far from Caldine called Puthia. She did, however, grow up on the capital world of Galaxia. Her father started from nothing and grew his slave trading empire, teaching young Hurtin how to trade flesh for Celtin. The locals said the pit goes on forever, and you can't reach the bottom. Fuerte had dragged himself up. He was clipping on his belt over his simple garb. It sported a Kurtz blade. Only Auserwählte, the chosen ones, Silvers for short, were allowed these blades. The current ruling people. Fuerte acquired his from an order Hurtin gave a few years back. With so many counterfeit blades around, no one really questioned it. "Do you think it goes on forever?" Fuerte looked up at her, pulling his belt into place. He said nothing and bent down to strap on his sandals. They wanted to blend in with the locals. "We cannot let my brother's efforts go to waste here. We have to find out who rules this so-called pit and make an ally of them." She slipped her shoulder into a mustard dress. It was a local color. She opened an engraved wooden box that rested on a desk next to the dresser. In it was a brown leather whip and a gold-hilted dagger. Better to leave the whip here. The dagger was a gift passed down to her from her father. He claimed a member of one of the 3 ruling families on Galaxia passed it to him. She could never remember the story quite right. She twirled the sheathed dagger in her hands. He was a real bastard, she thought. Her father was an all but loveless, callous man. He did, however, love his drink and Celtin, far outweighing any love he had for her and his numerous wives. He was kind enough, at least, to teach her everything she knew about business and surviving in an all-but-cold universe. Blade secured, dress sitting snug, and hair tied back, the pair made their way out the door, passing guards and important-looking Caldinians. She could estimate their importance by the quality of servants they had following them. It was her job to see and understand the value of a good servant. Some would nod, while others would mumble a greeting. She smiled and greeted back as best she could. Important people rarely reveal their true intentions, one of the lessons she was taught. The hotel they stayed at housed only the highest-ranking politicians, dignitaries, and people of importance. The task ahead would call for her to leave all of that behind, a life of hardship, blood, and conquest. A few floors down, they arrived at their destination. Room 322, she reminded herself. Hurtin looked around. Luscious green plants decorated the perfect hall. A few scattered guests passed by, and Hurtin nodded at them as they moved past. "Wait here," she ordered. Fuerte acknowledged her command with a sharp nod. She entered a room full of people dressed in all white from head to toe, traditional servant clothing. They wore porcelain masks with Hurtin's trademark red, H struck through with a diagonal painted line. One of them walked forward. She bowed her head. "Are you clear on the plan?" The rest were strapping on hidden blades to their ankles and other inconspicuous places. "We are, Madam H, but I'm afraid our plans have to change." Hurtin frowned, a few beads of sweat forming on her exposed forehead. "Change? And please tell me why they have to change." Her frown deepened. "It appears that the ruling families on this planet are no longer in charge," the woman replied in a monotone voice. "What on earth happened? Another rebel group?" Hurtin leaned in. "The royal silver we traveled with, Manfred, has taken over the royal palace. He and the units they sent a few weeks in advance now occupy the palace." "Ah, so he has seized control and enacted Kriegsrecht, martial law?" "No, Madam H, he has not. He did, however." "Spit it out. What happened?" "He killed each head of the 5 families. He slaughtered them all this morning." She shook her head. "Oh, Manfred, what have you done? This plays in our favor. Move to the second phase and wait for my message." The servant woman nodded. "Do not fail me now. They have to believe our cause to be just if they are to fight for us and the creators." She put her forehead to the woman's. "We won't fail you, Madam H. I swear it." "Good luck." Hurtin spun around, leaving the room. She directed Fuerte toward the exit with a curt nod. He followed closely as they headed down into the city center. The Chaldeanian capital was set up, like those of many planets in this sector, in a series of rings, spreading out from its center. The further the ring was from the middle of the city, the lower the socio-economic status of the locale. Their destination lay outside even the furthest reaches of the monumental city. The Pit. Chapter 2. Many Talents. The 2 men dragging the carriage strained, the Chaldeanian sun beating down harshly on their tan backs. "This is far enough," Hurtin bellowed. The men slowed down. The enormity of the pit wasn't something she had ever seen before. Only in the towers on the capital rivaled its magnitude. "It is, in essence, a colossal hole in the ground," she thought to herself. The pair dismounted, and she flicked a few Celtan coins toward the men, who gulped at some water from their leather flasks. The mine was by far the largest producer of energy crystals in their galaxy, a key component of the fuel used for space travel. "This is where it begins." Their sandals clopped in the fine sand as they approached one of the many lifts, carrying people, goods, and equipment in and out of the massive mine. The closer they got, the more noise they could hear. The sheer scale of the thing was almost unfathomable. Her brother had told her that the mine was something to behold, but actually being there was surreal. A few Chaldeanian guards meandered around. She found the place bizarre. The road leading up to the lifts had markets and stalls on either side of it. Some offered prostitutes, while others displayed bronze and gold jewelry, as was the custom here on Chaldean. A particular necklace caught her eye from a small stall close to her. How much? She nodded to the woman sitting on a maroon pillow, her collection of jewels strewn out in front of her. She mumbled something in idioma. Hertin rubbed the fine gold necklace gently between her fingers. At its end was a small triangle. Simple jewelry for a simple woman. She smiled and pulled her celtin pouch from her side. She jingled it in front of her. The woman raised 2 fingers. She didn't make eye contact with Hertin. Her face was covered in a myriad of piercings and nose rings. She stuck out her scrawny hand. Hertin placed the coins in her hand and gently folded them together. The woman looked up and gave a sheepish smile while nodding graciously. "You might need to learn idioma," a smooth voice said behind them. Hertin turned around as she finished clipping the necklace around her neck. The man had neatly combed salt and pepper hair. The deep crow's feet and brow lines marking his face indicated his advancing age. He stuck out his hand. Fuerte shuffled nervously. She flicked her index and middle finger toward the ground behind her back, signaling Fuerte to hold. "I am Bula," the man smiled widely. His hand hung in the air. Hertin tilted her head, smiled back, and shook his hand. "I am Hertin, and this is my companion Fuerte." "I can see newcomers a mile away," Bula continued. "Can I show you guys around the pit?" One of his cheeks was puffed up like a moon balloon. Hertin stared at him. All around, the stall owners hooped and hollered at the various people walking past. "I think we can manage, Bula, but thanks for your offer." She slowly turned away and started walking. "I really think your brother would want me to show you around, Hertin." She froze and turned back to him. "He must be of some use if he knows of my brother. I do not like people who know things about me, especially if I do not know them." Bula grinned. "Well, you are in luck. I am the best tour guide this side of the pit. I can guarantee you that." A torrent of brown spit launched from his mouth. Hertin stifled a gag, chewing tobacco. What backwoods hovel did he drag himself out of? She glared at him. His simple gray tunic did not give much away. A small, ornate dagger hung at his waist. "And what if I say no?" Hertin teased. Bula looked up for a bit, pursed his lips, and smiled. "My boss would be very disappointed." "Who the hell is this arrogant hick?" "Fine, let's go meet this boss of yours," she replied sharply after a moment's pause. "Perfect," Bula spat on the ground next to them. He walked past them toward the nearest lift. Hertin turned to Fuerte, leaned in, and whispered, "Keep your eyes on him. I don't trust him." Fuerte acknowledged her command with barely a nod. The lift operator ushered Bula, Hertin, and a small group onto the platform. Some carried baskets of food, while a guard was herding a group of slaves, interlined by cuffs tied around their ankles. Dust from the depths of the mine blew about the atmosphere of the place without rest. Hertin could taste the fine sand sticking to her lips. Fuerte covered his eyes. They looked over the ledge and down into the pit. Small lights flickered all around the enormous hole. It seemed to descend endlessly. The burly operator pulled a large lever, and the group of about 20 people started their journey into the depths. "Tell me about this leader of yours," Hertin mumbled in Bula's ear. The man grinned again, his filthy tobacco-stained teeth turning Hertin's stomach. "Oh, you will love him, Lady Hertin. He is a man of many talents." He spat a bit of brown over the lift's edge. "Yes, indeed. You will love him, I think. He comes from nothing like your family." "You know a lot about my past, do you? How do you know my brother?" Bula leaned over the railing, looked down into the darkness, then turned back to her. "He has been hard at work here, preaching about the creators you serve." The guard behind them shoved one of the slaves, causing the rest of them to almost stumble over. He spat at the man and swore in idioma. "My brother has done well then. Our cause seems to have gained momentum here." The large ropes creaked and groaned, and then suddenly the platform stopped. The lift operator opened the flimsy gate to the platform and let everyone out. Bulla leaned in. "Welcome to the pit, Lady Hurtin." He smiled at her. They stepped off the giant platform. Time to get to work. Chapter 3. Chaos and Order. Don't be scared of it. Bulla stood with his thumbs tucked into his thick leather belt. Hurtin looked down at the dark void below. Small lights flickered all the way down into the darkness. Even 10 floors down, she still couldn't see the bottom. The walkway was wide enough to fit 3 people, yet not a single railing or safeguard meant everyone walked and squeezed past each other to stay away from the edge. "Have you seen the bottom?" Bulla let a bit of spit dribble from the side of his mouth. "Only a few times. I'll take you to meet my boss." Hurtin lingered for a moment, staring into the blackness. The trio had passed guards, slaves, traders, and everything in between. Hurtin quickly got used to the constant rubbing of shoulders. The place stank of sour sweat and incense lit next to the dim lights. They would pass stalls etched into the sides and walls of the pit. They usually featured a guard or a tough-looking mercenary with a doblar by their side. Some places sold food, while others sold pleasure. She would nod at the important-looking men and women, those who were followed by a fit and healthy-looking servant. The place was full of hustle and bustle. It felt like they had been rubbing shoulders and scraping past strangers forever when Bulla tapped her on the shoulder. "In here," he said. He squeezed past her and they entered a moss-green door. She had figured that the colors meant something. The blue ones usually meant some sort of service, while the green ones meant wares and exotic goods. Stepping inside, Hurtin and Fuerte were met with a fragrant haze. "Welcome, friends," bellowed a large man from across the smoky room. Beautiful carpets and jewelry hung from the shop's walls. The big man sat in a chair much too small for his oversized body. It creaked at the slightest movement. "How can I help you? Please come in." His oversized jowls jiggled as he smiled at them, greeting them with that thundering voice. "Hello, I am Hurtin." She stepped forward and shook the man's puffy hand. "Best conceal at least a part of my identity for now, until I have a better idea of just who I'm dealing with." "Ah, I know all about you, Hurtin, and I see you've met Bulla." He pointed to Bulla, who had walked to the back of the fog-filled shop. He fiddled haplessly with some contraption. "Of course he knows about me. Why would the lackey if the leader didn't? Come on, Hurtin, it's game time. Remember your brother's note." Next to the man stood a fumador. Locals and people from the sector used them to smoke flavored tobacco. The vertical device had smaller smoking pipes connected to it to allow multiple people to enjoy the tobacco. The man let some white smoke slowly spill from his mouth. "I am Zango. It is a pleasure to meet you. What can I interest you in today?" Hurtin frowned at him. "Again with this pointless dance. I abhor these people. If you are the man I am looking for, you must know my brother." She stared at a lit display case full of various animal eggs in front of Zango. She recognized the dark egg of the zipper bird, but not much else. "People put these above their beds for good luck," the man said. "This one here is from the dark sector," he continued. Hurtin snorted loudly. "Even the Silvers are scared of Sector 4. They've barely explored a handful of planets there. And you expect me to believe that this mysterious egg is from there?" She pointed to the scaly, cobalt-colored egg. Zango smiled. "Your clothes certainly indicate that you are not from here." She looked up at him. "Your mustard dress is obviously worn to blend in." Hurtin gasped cheekily. "Oh my, you certainly have a keen eye." "My friends rely on that keen eye." He breathed deeply of the smoke from the fumador. The water at the bottom percolated. "Well, it seems like you and your friend here certainly know a lot about me. Why don't you tell me a little bit about whoever runs things in here." The man laughed, almost choking on the smoke as it trickled out in small bursts from his mouth and nose. "Your subtlety needs work, I will tell you that much," he said, his laughter fading. "This is a large mine in Sector 2, Hurtin. It is ruled and governed by the Silvers, as it has been for hundreds of years." The large man slowly forced himself up. The chair looked even smaller below his large frame. It creaked with every movement. Bulla handed him a cane. He moved toward the door, opened it, and smiled, waiting for Hirtin to step through. He followed closely behind. She paused at the edge of the pit, once again. Zango walked up beside her. He rubbed at his oversized chin, leaning on his cane. "I know you are the man I am looking for, Zango," she said, looking directly at him now. The man's sweaty face turned toward her. "I sell carpets and exotic eggs, Hurtin. I thank you for visiting my shop." He turned around and started hobbling back toward his dank shop, where Bulla was waiting in front of the door, left cheek chock full of tobacco. "Wait!" she yelled after him. Zango stopped and slowly turned. Hurtin unsheathed her dagger with her right hand and stuck out her left palm. The dagger's smooth and sharp edges glinted, even in the low light of the pit. Its blade's design was peculiar. The top half was colored a burned red, whilst the bottom, in stark contrast, shone a brilliant azure blue, a byproduct of the hardening and tempering processes. Her father bragged that only the best could create a blade that looked like this. Zango's smile disappeared. He looked on, the cane straining to keep the large man upright. She cut a small line through her left palm. She hardly had to press the blue side of the blade against her flesh for the blood to flow freely. It streamed down the side of her hand. Zango nodded. He walked back over to her and stuck out his meaty right hand. Bulla followed him now. He and Fuerte stood right behind them. Zango passed Bulla his cane. Hurtin skillfully flipped the blade and passed it to him. He made a similar incision with the clean red edge of the blade. "And now," he asked, "only those who have bled for the pit will know its true power," she recited in a monotone voice. Zango repeated the line and stared at her. They both held their bleeding palms over the darkness below. The blood dripped unceremoniously from their cuts. "Welcome, sister," Zango grinned at her. Chapter 4. He Bites. Zango pulled a crude piece of paper from a disorganized mess of boxes behind his shop's counter. "4 people," he said, placing the stained paper over the dim light, illuminating the display case between them. The map showed a long vertical shape with 4 sections. Each quarter had a letter, aside from the third or second from the bottom, which had a question mark. The top quarter had a Z next to it. The fourth quarter had the letter C next to it. "I assume these are the pit bosses my brother mentioned in his letters." Zango nodded as he tightened the bloody bandage on his palm. "Just like that. You would trust me with this information." Zango fell into his chair, wiped the sweat off his pale forehead, and proceeded to take a long drag from his fumador. "Your brother has helped make invaluable connections for this place. He said you would help unite us all under a single glorious purpose." Hurtin scratched her chin. "And what would that be?" "To finally be free of these damned oppressors. The Silvers, who rape our resources, murder our people, and take, never giving back." And do you believe in a higher power, Zango?" Zango added more sweat to his already damp handkerchief. "Your brother has told me about these creators you follow." He sniggered. "Bunch of tall tales told to kids. No, we will get this done the old-fashioned way. Overthrow and dominate, as is our right. Well, since we are sharing secrets, it appears my brother is traveling with a whisperer. Well, we like to refer to them as descendants of the creators, but you know, each to their own." He chuckled, and his jowls jiggled. You really believe that nonsense? She nodded. My brother's orders seemed to make sense now. Well, we must connect the dots, and to unite under a single purpose is a necessity I think we can all agree must happen. He nodded. Who is this bee in the second quarter below you? Hurtin asked. Zango gulped down a clear liquid from a flask, a few drops spilling onto the page Hurtin was pointing at. Fuerte paced slowly behind, scanning the exotic carpets. Bula stood next to Zango, passing him everything from his handkerchief to the flask he sipped from. "Ah!" exclaimed Zango. "You are going to love Bite." "Bite?" Her eyes jumped to Zango. "He controls the second quarter. We have a—" He stopped. "Working relationship." Zango burst out into a coughing fit that seemed to go on forever. "Are you all right, sir?" Bulla touched his shoulder to offer assistance, which was in turn met with Zango shooing him away. His wheezing barks echoed around the room. "I am fine," he said, out of breath. "Why the name?" she asked, frowning at the scene unfolding. "He controls the entire second quarter through fear with dreadhounds." Hurtin sucked at her teeth. "I hate dogs, especially ones trained to kill." Dreadhounds. How the hell is he controlling them? Only Silver Special Forces use those monsters, and even then they can only control a few at a time. Zango sat breathless with his face in his palm. He raised 3 fingers. "He has 3. It's all you need if you know how to control them." The Silver Empire loved Hurtin's family, as they provided numerous slaves to royal families and dignitaries across the universe. She remembered a wealthy boy from a prominent family would have one of these hounds chase his servants in a maze as a game. The screams never quite left her memory. Her father forced her to come on these trips as they sold flesh. Something about the reality of the universe, she recalled. Zango snapped his fingers. "Are you listening?" She composed herself. "You and your friend can stay in the room at the back of my shop." "Thank you, Zango. I will send Bulla in advance to tell Bite you are coming. Even then, I cannot guarantee he won't set his damned black beasts on you." Zango snapped his fingers again. "Send for something to eat on your way to Bite, Bulla." "We appreciate the hospitality, Zango." He half-heartedly raised his arm as the sweat glistened off of his balding head. Hurtin and Fuerte clambered their way through odds and ends to a tiny room at the back of the shop. An incense dispenser lazily puffed up a sweet aroma. It was the only sweet thing about the place. A desk and a single raggedy mattress. We are far from satin sheets and soft pillows now. Fuerte rummaged through the knickknacks on the steel desk. Papers, old food, and a few scattered Celten all featured prominently. She dragged her finger over a thick layer of dust on one of the corners of a small bedside table. "We need to go and find this so-called Bite." Fuerte spun around and tilted his head sideways. She ran her thumb gently down his veiny forearm. He smiled from the corner of his mouth. "I can already tell I am going to like him." She rolled her eyes. "Hurtin!" Zango bellowed from the front of the store. As they entered, the large man was taking another large sip from his flask. "Seems like your arrival could not have come at a more opportune time." "I heard the ruling families did not make it," she said in agreement. "This Manfred they sent from the capital who did all the killing, rumor has it you know him." "We grew up together. I used that fact to get myself here." Zango pressed his lips together and nodded. "I think it best you have some dinner and meet Bite tomorrow. After dark, his hounds are the only things that patrol the pit. Make sure you are behind a door after you hear the bell." "Yes, Zeng." "No hurtin'. Hear me now. Every other night someone braves walking about after curfew. The screams are etched into my memory." She stared blankly and did not reply. "Very well, we will stay and have some dinner and meet him in the morning." "Where will you go?" Zango smiled as he let out a small cough. My house is not in the pit, Hurtin. No, with my ailments and the damp air, I can't survive in here. A pretender, someone looking to put themselves in the ruling seat, it seems. Reminds me of myself. She nodded. Of course not, she replied with a smile. Chapter 5. Red Eyes. Her brother consistently referred to the hefty, perspiring man in their letters to each other. She figured it had to be Zango. He mentioned that he was the link between the outside world and the pit. However, his words hardly matched his actions, as she was warned. He offered services, backdoor deals, and everything else in between to fill his pockets with Selton. However, she did not know much about this bite. Her brother never ventured further down toward the lower half of the pit. He had warned her that the level of danger increased the deeper you went. I think it's about time we get moving. Hurtin slurped some leftover desert dog soup that Bulla brought them. She never minded eating like a commoner. It reminded her of her family's humble beginnings. Fuerte sat sharpening his blade. He always packed a sharpening stone. Are you ready? A voice from the dimly lit hallway asked. Bulla stepped forward to make himself known. What can you tell us about this bite? She asked. They passed the wares and fine carpets in Zango's shop. He does not play well with others. You could say he protects us from those up above. Hurtin stopped to look at him. The walkway was already busy with people walking past, haggling and arguing over the price of services. I thought Zango did that. No, he keeps the Silver's eyes off of us. He knows. Bulla paused. He knew Oberst Fowl personally before he lost his head. The trio rubbed shoulders with the many people passing them by on the way to the lift. They had passed numerous lifts, usually either going up or down. This one, however, stood empty. A single muscular guard waited on it. The front of the woman's neck was tattooed completely black. She would fetch a good price in the arena, was the first thing Hurtin thought. Bulla walked ahead of them and whispered something in her ear. She looked at him, then over to Hurtin and spat. Bulla waved them over. Not a fan of foreigners, Hurtin asked as they climbed on. The woman's eyes had dark rings all around. She wore brown leather armor and had a doblar clipped by her side. Her knotted hair was tied neatly. She smiled. Her teeth were stained dark red. She shook her head as locked eyes with Hurtin. Trying to goad me, are you? The ropes creaked and groaned as the hustle and bustle of the top level faded, and they moved deeper into the pit. Bulla stepped in between the pair. Don't be intimidated by her. Her leader serves a very important purpose here. Hurtin looked at him as he let a bit of tobacco fly from his mouth. Of course, she smiled. She can be glad I don't gouge out her damned eyes. The lift stopped on a floor with a few scrawny and beleaguered-looking slaves meandering about. A few paused to look at them. One even stuck his hand out as they exited the lift. I must leave you here, Hurtin. She stopped and turned to Bulla. Leave us? What do you expect we do here? If you can make it back, Zango will know he has the right person. A test with a raved lunatic. How similar they are to their oppressors. The woman smiled, flashing her gross, burgundy smile as she pulled the ropes to take Bulla back up. The men and women around smelt horrible. Some had missing limbs. Many had large bite scars or pieces torn from them. Many of their wounds had healed and become disfigured, having been badly sewn up. You shouldn't be here, one of them said as she and Fuerte carefully made their way around, looking for signs of this bite. The man hobbled beside them. You won't survive here, foreigner. The man had a crude lisp and was blind in one eye. You will feed his dark hounds with your tender flesh. Hurtin pinched her index finger and thumb together. Fuerte grabbed the man by his tattered collar and delivered a bone-crunching headbutt to his nose. The slave fell backward, moaning in pain. A few stopped to look at what was happening. A loud, continuous whistle had everyone staring upward. "Red eyes," a man mumbled next to them. "Red eyes, dark fur," another whispered. "Red eyes," another yelled as they all ran toward the nearest hole in the wall. Hurtin and Fuerte moved with the crowd, now running, clamoring, and doing whatever they could to get out of the walkway. Some stumbled and fell. No one even attempted to help them up. She almost fell a few times herself. The voices murmured and echoed the same lines. "Red eyes, dark fur." Where the hell is an open room? She passed a closed gate, people's faces pressed together, and a few stopped trying to pry it open. The crowd nudged her forward. She was stuck in the middle of what seemed to be a herd of wild animals headed to slaughter. A strong pull yanked her from the crowd as her neck snapped back. It was Fuerte who had pulled her behind a brown curtain. Etched into the side, a few other slaves sat, huddled up in the corner. Hurtin panted, out of breath. She dug her nails deep into Fuerte's forearm, peeking out of the curtain as the stream of people flowing past thinned. The stumbling and grunting was followed by a long, eerie silence. Fuerte placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She turned to look at him, realizing now that her nails had pierced his skin she pressed so hard. "Sorry, my love." He smiled softly. "Hurtin!" a voice bellowed from somewhere. The echo of her name bounced around. "Hurtin!" the voice sang out once more. "Come and face me if you dare. I am not scared of much, but giant mutts made for killing are certainly up there." She stepped into the walkway. "Here I am, Bite," she returned with feigned confidence. Chapter 6. The Test. The man known as Bite was nothing short of intimidating. A grotesque scar ran the length of his face, from the top of his head to the point of his sharp chin. Between that bald head and pointed chin, Bite sported a set of shimmering chompers made of some indeterminate metallic substance. He stood maybe 50 meters away from Hurtin, his shirtless torso advertising a myriad more scars, all displaying similar patterns. His dogs gave him those, thought Hurtin. Although she couldn't quite make out what was behind him, the glowering red eyes and snarling teeth soon made it clear that these were the mangy creatures he controlled to rule this section of the pit. "Well, well," chuckled Bite in a scratchy voice. "Bulla never told me he'd be sending down such a fine-looking whore," he smiled. The hound's growling increased. "You see, they know nobody should be on the walkway when I whistle." Fuerte slowly appeared behind her. "Oh, and here comes the scary muscle." The man was tanned, but his skin was lighter than most of Sector 2. "One whistle is all it would take, and these hounds would tear you apart. Everyone in this damned place, why must they all play at intelligence? Lie about holding any sort of real power? Why would you do that? We have so much we can help each other with," she replied, managing to hide her concern. Bite laughed. "You have it wrong, my pretty little dark-haired tramp." Fuerte clenched his fists. Hurtin flicked her index and middle fingers, ordering him to stay back. "No, I am the one who helps down here, princess. I am the one who allows you to live." The hounds continued to growl louder and louder as Bite came closer. 2 quick whistles from the corner of Bite's mouth, and the abnormally large, dark-furred beasts sat still, all malice disappearing from their demeanor. Slobber hung thick from their mouths. One licked its lips, whimpering. Bite was now face to face with her, not a meter away. "You ever seen that much power?" She smiled as he caressed her cheek. "Would you mind showing me around?" "Certainly," he gestured forward after a long pause. The dogs rose in unison and followed closely. "Oh, but I do not feel comfortable with your friend here, Hurtin. So Eins here will keep him safe while we play. Pass off ihn off," commanded Bite, pointing at Fuerte. The large dog locked eyes with him, plonked before him, and sat at the ready. That's how he controls them. He speaks the silver language with them. I would not move, my dark friend. Eins will most certainly kill you if you move. He gestured ahead once more as they walked down the empty walkway. You named it Eins? She frowned at him. As in the number 1 in the language of the Silvers? They are tools, Hurton. Not pets, but tools in a great machine. He gestured towards the entirety of the pit. You must be impressive if Zango sent you down. Usually ladies this pretty come down in pieces, he said, grinning. I've come to meet with all the leaders of the pit. The time to take back our planet and beyond is now. Bite stopped. His 2 remaining dogs stopped and sat down in sequence. Why is it always the pretty ones that are so stupid? He said in his grainy voice. We finally have a place not even the damned Silvers care about, and now we want more. He scratched furiously at his head, pulled a piece of dried meat from a small pouch hanging off his hip, and flicked it behind him where the dogs jumped and growled at each other, trying to get to it first. More showmanship. I hate him and his dumb beasts. You like living like this? Yes, he said loudly. Up there I was less than nothing. He pointed to the faraway light seeping in from the sun above them. She estimated they were at least a few hundred stories down. Even for a mine, this area of the pit looked run down. There was dried blood every few paces. Broken people stared at them through the prison grates as they walked on. What do you do here? Hurton asked. It's quite simple, really. You are either food or you are useful. He sucked at his shiny teeth. If it were not for his damned dogs, I would have slit his throat by now. I don't follow. Let me show you, he said as he pointed to an area of the wall of the pit. He truly is insane. Bite stepped forward and knocked on the wall in a distinct pattern. To her surprise, the wall was actually a hidden metal door, perfectly disguised. The hinges hissed and the door slowly slid open. This time, a man with his neck tattooed similarly to the woman on the lift looked at them. Completely blacked out ink. He nodded at Bite. Hurton could hardly see past him, but what she could see were bright lights, a long row of slaves, and a few guards between them. The guard then proceeded to hiss at Bite and shove him backward. His hounds growled as the door slid shut. Damn them, Bite scowled. Who do the... What was that? Hurton interrupted as Bite paced furiously. It's where the new stock goes. All the new flesh gets tested. The best gets sent further down while the others, well... The food, she interrupted. Exactly, he said enthusiastically. He is nothing short of a guard dog himself. Doesn't command the respect of whoever commands this tattooed bunch. Does it not bother you that you doom hundreds, maybe thousands, to become dog food, or worse, to serve in this hellhole? He shrugged. Sacrifices must be made, Hurton. He grinned his shiny grin. Speaking of which, I have a surprise for you. He motioned for her to walk ahead once more, and they continued around the bend. His dogs followed closely. She turned her head to see Fuerte standing patiently off in the distance, Eins laying quietly at his feet. Bite stopped and opened one of the many gated doors. Bewegen Sie zwei, he commanded. The slobbering beast galloped into the open cell. Hurton turned away to walk on when Bite grabbed her arm. Everyone is tested, Hurton, was all she heard as his fist crashed into her jaw, knocking her out cold. Chapter 7. Foam. No. The decorated cane tapped Hurton's bloody knuckles. How many times do I have to tell you it's outside for poultry and inside for dark meat? Her curly hair was neatly tied up. The servant barking the order was dressed in all white. She was burly with a sour expression on her older face. They sat in a lavishly decorated dining hall. It had all the trappings of someone with too much Selton. busts of old leaders, expensive curtains, a polished imported dining table. "Once more," said a man sitting at the opposite end of the long table in the shadow. "Soups and soft food," her small finger pointing to a spoon laid diagonally. She picked it up between two fingers, lifting a small, intricately decorated bowl with 3 fingers in her other hand. A thwack sent pain coursing through her chin, and the bowl clanged into the other plates and cutlery. "No, 4 fingers for a soup bowl." Hurton's face scowled. A few drops of blood trickled from her freshly cut chin. "They will never accept you as their own, Hurton," the man said in a monotone voice. "Remember that," he said, his voice slightly deeper. She looked up at the servant. "Remember that," she growled. Her teeth emerged from her mouth, her jaw unhinging. She leapt forward, swallowing Hurton's head whole. Hurton jerked upward, snorting. A low, thundering growl came from somewhere in front of her. "I wouldn't move, Hurton. Zwei will most definitely rip you apart if you do." The headache was excruciating. She tried moving spit around in her dry, bloodied mouth. She tasted fine sand and salty sweat in the air. "What the hell is this?" she asked, vision still blurry from the blow he had dealt her. "You think you are the first person to come in here and try to take what we've painstakingly built over so many decades? You are dumber than you look, Bite." Her eyes could finally make out small red eyes further on in the narrow room. The growls intensified. She slowly turned her head. Bite was smoking a burner while picking at his nails with her dagger. She slowly touched her side to feel where the holster had been. "If you sit still, Zwei won't eat you, but I wouldn't move. I haven't fed her for a few days now." She rubbed at her swollen jaw. "You would strike a woman like that?" Bite scoffed. "Where do you think we are, princess? No, your topside codes and rules don't apply here." She leaned backward. Her head pulsated with pain. "My brother's note really makes sense now. He needs to die." Across the pit, they heard a loud scream. "Aw, that sounds like it might need my attention. I'll be seeing you again soon, darling." Bite grinned, flicking the remainder of his burner away as he made his way toward the screaming. "Damn it, I hate dogs." "No, please don't leave." Bite stopped. "What if she attacks me?" She struggled through her words. Everything felt sore. Bite sniggered. "Then you die." He marched away, his trailing footsteps drowned out by the screams. She coughed as the dust from her cell tickled her throat. The growls intensified once again, the white teeth making an appearance. She would not have believed that animals like these existed until she saw them as a young girl, tearing up those servants. Dread hounds were found somewhere in Sector 3 and were bred exclusively to kill. Their beady red eyes were terrifying, second only to their disproportionately large head and teeth. "Why the hell am I here? I gave up everything for this stupid cause. The creators are long gone, and with it any hope for true freedom." The snarls grew stronger. So close and fierce, in fact, Hurton could hear dollops of foam drop from the beast's mouth. She sat curled up against the gated door, clenching her dress. The memories, the screams, and the fear all crawled closer. She whimpered, and a few tears rolled down her face. She closed her eyes and leaned back her head. "This is it, then." The snarls faded away. The sun was bright. She knew the courtyard well. The blut bushes left beautiful leaves all over. "Hurty! Hi, Hurty!" a voice behind her called out. "Manfred." She turned her head. The young boy waved her over. "It's your turn to catch me now." She turned around and ran to him. Her feet, however, did not move. The ground was muddy and dark. She sank deeper and deeper. "Help me, Manfred," she cried out. The boy continued to wave at her. "Come on, Hurty, come and catch me." The black muck enveloped her legs now. She was sinking faster and faster. "Help!" she screamed. The mud swallowed her quicker and quicker. Her head barely above it now, she let out a last desperate gurgle. "Hell!" A pale hand reached out and yanked her out into space. No sound, just the boy holding her hand and smiling at her. "I missed you, Hertie." He continued, but his face and body started glowing. "Why are you hurting me?" The boy's face curled up. "Ouch! Stop it, Hertin. Stop it!" He exploded into a fiery light. She was left floating in a void. "They will never accept you as their own, Hertin." A voice grumbled in the distance. She was jerked forward. The same shadowy man, 100 meters or so tall, towered over her in the vastness of space. "Never!" the voice screamed. Her head jerked forward. Her headache had subsided slightly. The cell was lighter than before. Still here then, I guess. "You make funny noises when you sleep." She felt a small tug at the back of her head. She turned her head to find Bite sniffing her hair. She scowled at him. "Crying were we." He tried pointing to a spot where the dirt was parted by dried tears on her cheek. She yanked her head away only to hear a low growl further back in the cell. "Well, I guess you and your stupid servant made it." He sighed. "Zango is looking for you." Chapter 8. Snarls. Bite slid the gate open. The dread hound, with a menacing yet controlled grace, paced out, sniffing at Hertin and giving her face a slobbery lick before gracefully exiting the cell. Hertin unclenched her fists, her palms bearing the dried blood from where her nails had dug in. "Can I come out now?" Bite smiled, and his dog sat patiently, waiting for his next command. "Funny what a night in a cell can do for a person's manners," he chuckled. "Why, yes, of course you may, my dear Hertin." She got up, stumbled out of the cell, and coughed. Her eyes opened to a dark, muscly forearm helping her up. "Fuerte," she smiled at him and embraced him. "I could tell he wouldn't do what I told him, but when I threatened to kill you, he was all ears. I find it strange that a servant would do anything for his master, don't you?" She squeezed Fuerte tightly, tighter than she might have ever before. She looked at his face. His expression told her he was worried. "Well, this beautiful reunion is a tad drab, so shall we?" Bite gestured ahead, back where they came from. It was strange being in a place where everything was connected by a large, round walkway. Hertin composed herself and dusted herself off. "My dagger," she demanded, sticking out her hand. Bite laughed and turned his back, walking away from them. "Come on, we're wasting time," he said impatiently. It was daytime again, she figured. The light streamed in from the top. Off in the distance, she could see the small lift they arrived on making its way down to their floor. The bleak-looking slaves parted or walked in the opposite direction at the sight of Bite and his hounds. They passed a few feeding troughs where slaves were hunched down, scraping what slop remained into their mouths. "Keeps them nice and fat," Bite commented as they passed another one of them. "This place truly is hell. Even slaves shouldn't be subjected to this." The ropes groaned as the same woman who operated the lift yesterday pulled it into position. Bulla stood with his thumbs tucked into his belt. He sent some tobacco and spit flying off to the side. "And how was the night?" Hertin gave him a stern look. "Disappointingly, they survived." Bite piped up. Bulla nodded lightly. "Well, I for one am happy." "I need a word, Bite. Please send your hounds away." "Patrouilleren," he ordered in a loud voice. The animals rose up and made their way around the walkway, slaves staying well clear. Bulla was off the side of the lift. He spoke in low tones to Bite. The pair had their backs turned. I could kill him, Hertin thought. One of her father's many painful lessons came crashing down on her. Always strike at an enemy's weakness. She motioned nervously. Fuerte put his hand on her shoulder gently and shook his head. She shrugged it away. "It could go wrong. He could kill me, his dogs." She clenched her fists and felt the dried blood on her palms. No, he has to die now. Hurtin sprinted forward, unsheathed her dagger from around Bite's waist, and plunged it deep into his back, ripping it out again in a single fluid motion. Bulla fell backward. The tattooed woman unsheathed her blade, but Bulla reached up, putting his arm in her way. Bite stared at Hirtin and Fuerte momentarily, angered and confused by this sudden outburst. The pitter-patter of blood on the subterranean floor broke the silence. Killed by a whore? Bite spat as blood oozed from between his lips. He grinned, put his fingers to his mouth, and let out one loud, continuous whistle. Fuerte sprinted forward and pushed Bite. He crashed through the flimsy wooden railing. He didn't stop whistling even as he fell to his demise. As the high-pitched death throes of the man once known as Bite quickly disappeared, one word flashed across Hurtin's mind. Hounds. Her gaze snapped to where she'd seen the dread hounds just moments before. They weren't there. They were much, much closer. Bright red eyes locked on Hurtin, needle-like teeth bared, and plumes of angry, heated breath spewing from their mouths as they sprinted toward the woman marked for execution by their master just moments ago. They moved unnaturally fast, covering multiple meters with each stride. "Damn it! Pull us out of here! Hurry!" commanded Bulla. People ran and jumped out of the way. Some decided to jump into the pit rather than risk being trampled to death by the beasts. The dogs sped up as the lift groaned, slowly making headway. Some slaves had jumped on out of sheer desperation, making it harder for the tattooed woman to pull it up. Bulla ran over and kicked one over the railing. His screams echoed all the way down into the void. Fuerte sprang into action and helped the woman pull. The dogs galloped closer and closer, knocking innocent victims into the depths and taking wild bites at others. One slave's screams were cut short as a sudden snap of Sway's jaws removed her head. Another flailed about helplessly, a large hole puncturing his torso after being run over by Ainz. Hurtin flipped another crippled woman over the edge without thought or remorse. Only two remained now. Bulla looked over to Hurtin and nodded at her slightly. The two slaves grabbed on for dear life. The man closest to her grabbed her arms, not allowing her to stab him. She knocked his skinny body backward with a swift headbutt, sending him tumbling down. It also sent her reeling backward in pain, and she dropped her dagger. Next to her, Bulla groaned. "Get off!" he shouted. The man fell limply as Bulla shoved him off the platform. Finally, away from the edge, a deep snarling made them turn their heads. One of the hounds had managed to latch onto the wooden platform, even though they were a few meters in the air. Its teeth dug in deep. Fuerte and the tattooed woman strained, trying to keep the lift going up. The other two dogs jumped and roared furiously, foam and spit flying everywhere. Bulla shook his left arm. He looked like he was in pain. Hurtin dragged herself across as the noise grew closer. They were moving down. Fuerte and the woman groaned in desperation, trying to keep the platform from slipping down. Hurtin picked up her dagger and leapt forward. She plunged her blade deep into the beast's snout. In most cases, this is where the animal would give up. Dread hounds, however, are relentless. Not only this, but their bite is one of the most powerful of all known canines. The mutt didn't flinch. "Damn dog! Filthy, stinking beast!" Hurtin used the frustration of the moment, lifting her blade to shank the creature once again. But before she could, a large, steel-toed boot crashed into the hound's upper lip. It flinched. Hurtin looked up as Bulla rained down boot after boot on the dog. His face a mixture of fear and fury. He didn't stop until finally a well-placed heel stomp caved in the especially thick skull of the dread hound. As its bodily function ceased, its jaws released the wooden platform and it floated, motionless, down into the darkness. The other hounds continued howling and gnashing as their sibling passed by them. Finally, they were safe. Chapter 9. Sweaty. "What have you done?" Bulla asked, his tone accusatory. He scooped the old tobacco from his cheek and flung it off the side of the lift. They all sat in silence as the lift slowly ascended back to Zango's quarter of the pit. Bite was a necessary evil. Hurtin scoffed. He was as mad as those damned hounds of his. The tattooed woman hissed at her comments. Her skin glistened with sweat after their narrow escape from death. Hurtin could feel the grime and muck from her few days down here sticking to her skin. "I need a shower and a massage." "Come on." Bulla swiftly exited the small lift. Fuerte helped her up. The trio passed the merchants and servants on their way to Zango. A few floors down, people were probably getting torn apart by beasts. The thought made her shiver. Small shops etched into the wall hollered at them, yelling about a bargain. Bulla held the door to Zango's shop open for them. Zango was sitting behind his counter, reading the local paper. His small spectacles rested on his plump nose and cheeks. He looked up. "What the hell happened to you?" "We encountered your friend, Bite." She slammed her dagger on top of the counter. A streak of clotting blood splattered across the glass. Zango looked at the dagger for a moment, then he stared at Hurtin. Beads of sweat began to form all over his face. His shirt already had sweat stains all over. A bit of blood ran down the side of his mouth. Bulla stepped forward from behind him. "Zango, are you okay?" Zango looked up at him, grabbed at his shoulder, and fell face first on his glass countertop. He let out a deep sigh. "Zango." Bulla tried propping him back up on his chair. He could hardly move the heavy-set Zango. He held 2 fingers at his neck to feel for a pulse. "I think he's dead." Bulla looked over at Hurtin and Fuerte, who stood motionless a few strides back. "What happened to him?" Hurtin asked. "He just fell over." Bulla brought his head closer to Zango's and whispered something in his ear. "Here, you'll need this." After a long pause, he held out her dagger to her. She took it slowly from him and returned it to its decorated sheath. "What now?" she asked. Bulla reached into a small leather pouch. He started packing some chewing tobacco in his cheek. He turned around and rummaged through the boxes and disorganized mess behind the counter. She recognized that stained piece of paper. Bulla pointed to the 3rd sector on the map of the pit. It had a question mark scribbled onto it. "We're going deeper?" she asked. Bulla looked up at her. "Zango obviously trusted you, and I'm your guide." He folded up the paper neatly and burned it away over a candle at the end of the countertop. A small stream of blood flowed from Zango's pale mouth. "I'm not sure if I can go down again, Bulla. We hardly made it back." Bulla smiled at her. "It's said no one knows who rules the 3rd quarter of the pit." He brushed the remaining ash and embers from the burnt paper off his hands. "I am sure the pit can wait another day. It is worth it, Hurtin. I promise." Fuerte placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She looked at him. She knew that look. "We've come too far to lose heart now." "Very well, let's head down." "Great news. I'll send some food and some bowls for washing. It's not the luxury you are used to, Lady Hurtin, but it's the best we can do in here." He smiled. "Thank you, Bulla." "Of course," he nodded. "I'll be back in a few hours. I need to arrange help to move Zango's body." "Rest up." She nodded in agreement. They paused for a moment, looking at the large man illuminated by his countertop. Dark red pools had formed around his face. Bulla walked out and the door closed behind him. Hurtin lunged forward and embraced Fuerte. Her embrace turned into a long, passionate kiss. "I was so afraid." He held her tight. "We could have died, Fuerte." They headed into the back room. They fell onto the lumpy bed. It did not take her weary mind long to fall asleep in the safety of Fuerte's arms. She sniffed at her dress covered in dust, all manner of dirt, and who knows what else. They managed to at least wash themselves to be presentable. The bread and stew were a welcome addition. She finished tying her curls up in a neat ponytail. "You ready, my Fuerte?" He was rummaging through Zango's desk. He would toss the odd trinket over. So far, he had found an old smoking pipe, a dented plasma-round casing, and a diary. It went into great detail about all of the 5 ruling families and who to connect with to help his standing. It mentioned who ran what illegal industry to fill their pockets. One thing she found peculiar was that all of the families were involved in sending vast quantities of energy crystals to an unknown buyer, Dlaw. Everyone in the 4 sectors knew that Kaldeen traded crystals on the black market. It was, however, assumed it was to space marauders or pirates on a small scale. The Celton made by this would most likely make Kaldeen one of the wealthiest planets in the galaxy. "You ready?" Bula stood in their doorway. Hurtin flipped the small diary shut and placed it on the bed. "Let's get to it." Chapter 10. Bald Man. The ropes creaked and the buzzing of the top quarter fell away. Hurtin found the pit to be a strange place, possessing a cold beauty. Here, extreme chaos and order coexisted, making sense in their own twisted way. Throughout her life, she had worked with slaves and warriors capable of crushing skulls with their bare hands. There was a simple, brutal honesty to it all, and she felt the pieces falling into place. She was halfway to accomplishing her goal, discovering who controlled the last 2 quarters, the key to ruling the entire pit. "We will get through this," Hurtin whispered to Fuerte, who grinned back from the corner of his mouth. She recalled the day her father ordered Fuerte's tongue to be cut out. It happened when his mother attempted to steal extra bread for them from the kitchen. Instead of her getting lashed, Fuerte volunteered to have his speech removed. She'd never heard a peep out of him since, finding his silence a comfort in a world full of deceitful noise. Bula's mouth chewed rhythmically as the tattooed woman strained, and their small lift descended. Bite's old quarter was barren, devoid of a single beleaguered-looking slave or dog. The thought of those hounds sent a cold shiver down her spine. What the hell happened here, she wondered. Bula's muffled speech broke through her haze. "The leadership of the 3rd quarter is a mystery, Hurtin." "Why is that, Bula? Surely people would know who controls the place." He looked over the edge, letting some brown spit jet from his mouth. "Zango figured out it's these 2 sectors that control it all, so I've been digging around here. I am sorry about Zango. Any news on the cause of his death?" He pressed his lips together. "It means a lot, Hurtin. They knew he wasn't in the best health, so they suspect his heart gave way." She shook her head slowly. "The 3rd quarter, from what I've found out, is the storage quarter. For all the mind energy crystals. Let me show you." The lift came to a stop. The tattooed woman clipped the lift to the side and engaged the brakes. The quarter was surprisingly well lit. Large lights brought from the top side dispersed around all of the levels. The same guards with tattoos stood in front of black doors all around them. Sometimes, one of them. There was no noise. They could hear the hum of a light every time they passed. "You know how the Silvers have always won their wars. The glorious might of their empire, of course. Their warriors were genetically gifted to rule," she said with a smile as the trio slowly walked around. Bula smiled at her sarcasm. "Time, Hurtin." "Time? What do you mean?" "No rebellion has ever won because they cannot afford to outlast them. The Silvers have always had time and endless resources on their hands." Bula opened a pristinely painted black door. The room was unlike anything she'd seen on this planet, let alone the pit. It had a completely metallic interior, modern in its design, with strange animals from across the universe set in a jelly-like substance behind a glass case in the walkway. Hurton recognized a few from her travels, but there were things with tentacles and antennas that she found repulsive. The long metallic tunnel led to a sturdy-looking metallic door guarded by two of those all-too-familiar guards with their dark neck tattoos. Bulla nodded at them. One of them pressed their hand into a console off to the side. The door hissed and slid open. The room reminded her of the palaces she frequented with her father, that she grew up in later on. From what she could see, the room was meticulously decorated. The place had a cold, calculated look about it. A bald man sat in the corner behind a canvas and easel. A stuffed zipper bird was perched on a sideways branch under a spotlight. There was a tank of sorts in the middle of the room, but in the low light, Hurton could not quite make out what it contained. "Chloe," Bulla said in a monotone voice. "Bulla," the bald man returned in a similarly dreary fashion. He peered around his canvas, his deep blue eyes almost sparkling in the low light. The man added a few more strokes to his canvas. "I have someone I would like you to meet, Dlaw." "Art takes time, Bulla," he replied. The gentle brush strokes continued behind a low orchestra that played from speakers around the room. Bulla tucked his thumbs into his belt, letting some brown spit dribble from his mouth. Delawe paused, gently clicked the brush back into a container and flicked on a switch. The room and the tank in front of them lit up. She frowned and took a few steps backward, gulping down a sudden urge to vomit. The tank contained two slave bodies floating about. They had clearly been decomposing for some time, with chunks of flesh hanging from their bones in the murky green water. "Are they not splendid?" the slender man said, stepping toward them. As soon as she gathered herself, she recognized that the man had to be from the Travel Guild. His tall, lanky build, his blue eyes, and the single patch of hair left on the front of his otherwise bald, shiny scalp. Dlaw ran a long fingernail across the outside of the bubbling tank and looked over at them. "They were a gift from Zango," he said. "This is the buyer of all the energy crystals. Why are they buying so much illegally?" "It is a pleasure to meet you, Lady Hurton." Dlawe stuck out his bony hand. "I never told you my name." "I know," he smiled at her. Chapter 11, Birds That Caw. "Travel Guild. What are they doing here? Are they in charge of this quarter?" Dlaw observed the bubbles forming around the decaying flesh of the men in the tank. "So, Hurton, how is it you find yourself here in my humble abode?" He wore a thick necklace. It was swaying from side to side with every exaggerated gesture and movement of his slender body and arms. "If you know my name, I am sure you would have heard about Zango's departure to the afterlife." He nodded slowly. "Well, his diary mentions you by name and how much Selton you spend buying the energy crystals mined here. The thing I find puzzling is why a member of the Travel Guild is buying vast quantities of black market energy crystals." She smiled at him. He scratched at his chin. "Not too strong or too mild." He turned around to his tank full of floating bodies. "What?" she interjected. "The acid, decomposing them. It had to be the perfect strength to capture every part of the process." "Is it true what they say about the Travel Guild, then? Their ways are almost as foreign as their motives," Hurton jibed at him. "Calculated is the term I would use." He turned his head and the light glistened from it. "Very well, Bulla. Show her around." He continued to look at the bodies floating aimlessly. "I am no." Bulla gently placed his hand on her back and shook his head at her. "See you later, old friend." Dlaw did not move as they all turned and marched out the same way they came in. Visibly frustrated at the snub, Hurton turned to Bulla. "Every conversation in this place feels like it asks more questions than reveals answers." Bulla nodded. "It's how it's been kept from the Silvers for this long." She pressed her lips together. I suppose you are right. Come on, I have a lot to show you, Hurtin. This is it. This is the rebellion that wins. Here we will build the foundations of a free universe. Bulla walked ahead. She still could not believe how quiet it was. The humdrum of the first quarter was obviously designed to hide whatever it was they were doing down here. Bulla stopped at another blacked-out door. A large, black-necked guard let them in. A similar metallic tunnel greeted them. Hurtin figured the Travel Guild had some interest here, but she saw their architecture in these tunnels and rooms. Since the tragedy of Toria, it was well known that they were the most advanced race in the universe. The metal and pristine maintenance were a strange sight compared to the dust and sand in the rest of the pit. Bulla whispered something to one of the two guards guarding a large metallic door. Once again, one of them opened it by placing their hand in the console. It hissed and slid open. A bellowing cackle of noise flooded into the tunnel. Hurtin instinctively covered her ears against the deafening noise. Bulla waved her over and pointed ahead. From the noise and growing up in the capital, she knew it had to be thousands of zipper birds. They passed the caged birds, squawking and cawing at them. Their cages had what looked like sponges set up all around. The birds would rub against them, and the oil from their glands would rub off and flow into a collector below their cages. The trio pressed on to another door. This time it slid open by itself after a sensor picked them up. The noise stopped the moment the door clicked shut behind Fuerte. Fuel? You're making fuel here, right? You need zipper bird oil to mix with the energy crystals. Bulla sent a large mouthful of spit and tobacco over the metal walkway they were on. He ignored her. They rounded a corner, and her eyes grew wide in disbelief. There was a fuel production plant floor below the walkway they were on. She had seen these only in the capital before. Workers were dressed in heat-protectant suits. The process was dangerous. The reaction of unstable crystals was what helped propel their spaceships off the ground. These plants required specialists that she, up until this point, believed only existed in the capital. The place was perfectly maintained. She did not understand much of the science behind it all, but knew that someone with deep pockets was helping their cause. Machines pressed, and workers yelled on the production floor. Every few seconds, an alarm would bleep. Why is the Travel Guild investing all of this resource into this? Why does anyone in our universe do anything, Hurtin? She did not answer him back. She rubbed at her swollen jaw. Power. I think the Travel Guild finally found a cause that could propel them to the throne they so desperately desire. She stared across at thousands of neatly stacked fusion containers. They have all this fuel, but it still doesn't make sense. Come now, Hurtin. Surely a mind as sharp as yours can put it all together. Bulla loaded some fresh tobacco into his mouth. Without resources and their ships, our silver friends won't have the time to outlast us. She smiled. The Travel Guild was stockpiling vast quantities of fuel and resources for one thing: war. They controlled space travel, and with more than enough fuel, they could completely command travel or outlast the Silvers. The Silvers are greatly reliant on their ability to move their large fleets or armadas with their thousands of troops. Stopping them from doing so, or even starving them of the resources needed to move these troops and ships, could actually mean victory and the dawn of a new era. The only resource the Travel Guild was lacking was the manpower to enforce their will upon the galaxy, or at the very least, motivate and manipulate the actions of those already in charge. That's great, but no war has ever been won by resource stockpiles. Bulla smiled. Can't get anything past you, eh? There is someone you need to meet in the fourth quarter. He tucked his thumbs into his belt. Chapter 12, Skull Throne. The all-too-familiar creaking of the thick rope broke the otherwise quiet descent. So, Zango managed the silvers and greased the right palms to keep them from ever taking a closer look at what was happening here. Bulla nodded. I think you are finally starting to understand this place. It was tough, but if I can convince Dlaway and whoever it is we're going to meet to trust me, I think I can command the loyalty of the entire pit. They heard a low drum and then the loud bellow of unified voices from below. Modern lighting systems from Quarter 3 were replaced by lanterns and fires all around. The tattooed warriors were dispersed among other slaves, running exercises and drills. The unified chanting and cheering became louder and louder until they finally reached the bottom of the pit. We're finally here. The place was brightly lit, with muscular men and women running in neatly ordered groups to perform different tasks, all led by a slave marked by a dark neck tattoo. The bottom had many paths carved that led away from the center. They would hear chants and grumbles from them every so often. A few strides over, a large bonfire burned furiously. Smoke rose from it, and Hurtin could see the sweat glisten from everyone down here. Another area had slaves training in formation, blades clanging off each other. What's going on here, Bulla? This truly is a mine. He walked ahead a tad. The gigantic flame illuminated his face. We could not miss delivery, or the Silvers would send their people to investigate. He looked up at what they could see of the sky many floors above. It has been difficult, what with the Travel Guild wanting more, and some of the veins drying up. He pointed to two large cave-looking entrances that were crudely boarded up. I fear they grow suspicious. However, your friend murdering all the royal family heads will certainly shift the focus. Who are the people with the neck tattoos? Bulla walked ahead. I'll show you. Fuerte grabbed her shoulder and shook his head. The muscles in his neck tensed. What now, my love? Can't you see? We are so close. He looked down. She shrugged his hand away, following Bulla. Silvers would never go past Bite. I guess they figured if a man as crazy as that was in charge that far down, they wouldn't want to know how things get done down here. A waft of death and decay flooded into her nose. In the low light and shimmer, she saw a few bodies surrounded by blood a few 100 meters opposite the large flame. A loud thud as another body fell beside the other few. It burst open and blood splattered everywhere. She sat on her knees, dry heaving at the gruesome sight. She held back her stew. Fuerte gently helped her up. Another perfectly painted door opened to a pristine metallic tunnel. No guard stood in front of the second door. Bulla pressed his hand and the door slid open. They were at a T-junction. Bulla spun around. Look at what Selton can buy you. He went down the right corridor and opened another hissing door to an industrial weapons manufacturing plant. Blades, plasma rifles, Eisen shields, and every manner of weapon hung in neat rows in racks below, where the plant made all manner of noises. Workers in heat-protected suits once again tidily assembled the weapons, hanging them in the correct areas below. All of this exists, and the Silvers have no idea? He scratched at his beard. Some of the lower-ranking family members were starting to get suspicious, but you know how Silvers are. They believe that no one will ever challenge their absolute power. The plant made hisses, clicks, and loud bangs. The workers scurried around, keeping the various machines and smelters going. Let me show you something Selton can't buy you. Hurtin grabbed his arm. I really am sorry about Zango. He nodded at her and smiled. Thank you, Hurtin. The best is yet to come. She nodded in agreement, and the trio went to the other side of the junction. Another door slid open to complete darkness. Bulla turned around to them. Don't get lost now. He walked into the darkness, his gray tunic fading into the all-consuming black. Their feet pitter-pattered on the metal walkway. Something feels strange. An arm snatched at her from the darkness. Careful. There are steps, Bulla warned. They descended for what felt like forever, not a single speck of light. She carefully maneuvered forward, sticking her arms out to feel for Bulla. She could hear Fuerte stumbling around behind her. Was that a... She heard a breath next to her, then another, and another. She reached out, trying to feel for Bulla. She felt nothing. Bulla, she whispered. Fuerte grabbed her arm. The breaths grew louder. Bulla, she yelled. Suddenly the room was ablaze with light. Hurtin gasped as her eyes adjusted to the surprising brightness. Sat before her on a throne of humanoid skulls was the largest man she had ever laid eyes on. Like the others, his neck was tattooed dark black and the sides of his head shaven. He wore a loincloth that barely fit, and in his right hand hoisted a spear bigger than even the tallest trees on her home world. She could not believe what she was seeing. Even a Grober would look minute next to this behemoth. Bulla stood next to the man sheepishly. In another instant, the walkways lining the walls of the mine were even further illuminated. Hurtin sat down, the intensity of the situation overwhelming her. Thousands upon thousands of the tattooed warriors filled all of the space around them. They stood in perfect lines, not making a single noise. While Hurtin was still attempting to gather herself, the giant rose from his throne. He was at least twice the height of Bulla, who wasn't short by any measure. In a voice that shook the very ground she sat on, he spoke. You stand in the throne room of the Chosen. Name yourself. I am Hurtin, your Excellence, she stuttered. The Chosen grinned, his teeth the same dark shade of red as his followers. What have you come here for, Hurtin? I have come to meet with the one who rules the pit. Are you the one whom I seek? The Chosen let out an earth-shattering laugh. Silly woman, there is only one among us fit to command the marked. Who may that be? Him! He raised his large free hand and pointed to the smaller man at his side. Bulla, Chapter 13, Father's Daughter. Bulla, what does he mean? Bulla sent brown spit flying from his mouth. He clapped his hands loudly. You made it to the deepest depths, Hurtin. How could I have been this blind? He walked down the steps to the throne. You see, I realized something very early on in my life. He looked over to Hurtin, waiting for her to ask a question. What is that, Bulla? She said sarcastically. Those who truly know sacrifice will understand how to live in peace. I suppose I'm not surprised that you are cryptic, even now. Bulla paced backwards and forwards slowly. Widowmaker, right? He asked her. Hurtin didn't reply. It had to be. An odorless, colorless, slow-acting poison that only took effect a few days after Zango cut himself with that beautiful blade of yours. He waved his finger at her. I will admit it took me a bit to figure that one out. But when I remember how skillfully you had my friend cut himself with the red side of that tempered dagger, I knew. She clapped her hands this time. You are not as stupid as you look then, I suppose, Bulla. Bulla flicked his fingers. The marked soldiers surrounded them, blocking the walkway from where they came, their gazes firmly locked on Hurtin and Fuerte. You thought that the intel your brother supplied you with meant that you had enough of a picture of how things worked down here to be able to just waltz on in and convince us to join your doomed crusade. He chuckled. Oh, how beautiful the irony. He continued to laugh. She was confused by his comments. What happens now? Always in a rush, Hurtin. From the moment I set my eyes on you, you needed to be at the next destination. He stood next to one of the marked. He tapped the man's cheek, and the man opened his mouth. As a lady from the capital, I am sure you know that in order for a silver boy to become a man, to become a soldier, earn his blade, and so on and so forth, he has to take a life. He stopped, locking eyes with her. My opponent understands sacrifice, and therefore, so must we. She looked at Fuerte, who had his curls drawn. Fighting would be an exercise in futility. They understand sacrifice. He pointed around the room. The red teeth are from the bodies you saw dropped outside. They're cannibals, she yelled. Yes! Real sacrifice, sacrificing their humanity in the name of a free planet, a free Galaxis. You're sick, she spat on the ground. Oh, Hurtin, so quick to anger, just like your father. She clenched her fists. You do not know sacrifice, Hurtin. You sold flesh, you profited off selling your fellow man. The marked drew their Doblar blades in unison. How many have died under your rule here, Bulla? He shook his head. You still don't get it. Our small community here in the pit is but a small sacrifice for what needs to happen in the wider universe. Is this where you kill us? I could have killed you numerous times, but your brother travels with someone who might be of great use to us now at this pivotal moment. That damned whisperer? Ha! Now who's the one believing tall tales and magical stories? Bulla let out 2 small whistles. The marked parted ways as 2 dreadhounds came galloping down the walkway, pausing for a moment to snarl at Hurtin and continuing on to Bulla. They sat patiently as he flicked something from his pocket into their mouths. Should you pass the test of real sacrifice, I will call you my sister. She scoffed at him. You are insane to think I will do anything you say. Bulla smiled. You think you have a choice in the matter. She looked over at Fuerte and mouthed, I am sorry, at him. He smiled at her from the corner of his mouth. I love it when he does that. Kill Fuerte, Bulla commanded in a low voice. She shook her head. I told you. You are... I said, kill Fuerte. She was jerked into her father's dining room once more. He stood next to her. Do it, he said, his voice booming all around. She looked across the table to Fuerte. Her hand moved to her golden dagger in front of her. Stop it, Hurtin. You can't Kai... Her hand shook violently, but it picked up the dagger. Kill him, her father commanded sternly. She looked down at the dagger and backed up. Fuerte stood right in front of her. The dark red blute bush petals fell on her arm. Do it, Hurty, young Manfred sang behind her. Her dagger plunged deep into Fuerte's side. She gasped, choking as she fell to her knees and came suddenly back to the walkway in the room, full of dread. Fuerte stumbled over. He pulled the dagger from his side. Blood flowed freely from his wound as he knelt in front of her. She gathered herself. What have I done, my love? She embraced him. He made small grunts. The pain of the wound was unbearable. She lay him down on the walkway, never breaking eye contact with him. Tears streamed down her face. She kissed him gently. His glassy eyes stared back at her. Goodbye, my love. Real sacrifice, Bulla said. She looked up at him through her puffy eyes, tears streaming down her swollen jaw. She flung herself up and grabbed the dagger. Drop it, Bulla yelled. Her arm turned to ash and she shook it. A split second later it was fine, but her dagger was on the ground next to her. Bulla shook his left arm, wincing. I need your connections, your influence, and your cunning ways, Hurtin, but I can do this without you. She fell to her knees, looking up. What have I done? How can I go on? My brother needs me, but where? Take my hand, sister, and truly embrace those you claim to serve. She looked at Bulla's hand, then down at her dagger glinting in the light, then back at Bulla. The dread hounds whimpered behind him. She smiled. Brother. Afterward. This story reveals a lot. Most importantly, that Max might not be so special. The stakes are very high, and it sets the events for the second main novel in motion. These stories are a way to expand the already large galaxy and give you deeper insight into the people and places that inhabit Galaxis. Thank you for reading. Until next time, M.B. Kruger.